Hello everyone, welcome to our channel. Aaj আমি 29 August পৰা এটা নিউজ কৰিবলৈ গৈ আছো. Can we waive our fundamental rights? ISRO solar mission at Delhi summit demonstrates climate leadership. News media versus ChatGPT. So coming from the news analysis from the Assam Tribune newspaper, can we waive our fundamental rights? Now, we all know that the fundamental rights are enshrined in Part 3 of the Constitution of India, which guarantees civil liberties so that all Indians can live in peace and harmony in the country. Fundamental rights are equal for all the citizens of India. So, the main purpose of fundamental rights is to guarantee to all the Indians that they can live in peace and in harmony in the country. Let us see some of the fundamental rights enshrined in Part 3 of the Constitution. Right to equality, Article 14 to 18. Right to freedom, Article 19 to 22. Right against exploitation, Article 23 to 24. Right to freedom of religion, Article 25 to 28. Cultural and educational rights, Article 29 to 30. Then right to constitutional remedies, Article 32. Now the question is that was raised in the article is, can fundamental rights be waived? So what does doctrine of waiver mean? Doctrine of waiver as defined by Black's Law Dictionary is the intentional or voluntary relinquishment of a known right. So a right which has been given to you, you can choose it voluntarily whether you want to exercise that right or not. So doctrine is based on the principle that a person is the best judge of his own interest, and when given full knowledge, the person should be allowed to decide for himself. That is what the doctrine of waiver is saying. Waiver is when a person intentionally and with full knowledge gives away his right to exercise. Waiving a right means that a person can no longer assert that right and is precluded from challenging the constitutionality of that law for the benefit of which the right is waived. An individual possesses certain legal rights which are conferred upon him either by the constitution, statute or a contract. So in India, a person can waive rights conferred by a statute or rights arising out of a contract, but he or she cannot waive constitutional rights or rights guaranteed by the constitution itself. So ki kunbur rights waive off koribo pare, which is conferred by a statute or rights arising out of contract, kintu constitutional rights ketiyao waive off koribo nware. Please remember this. Now let us see what are statutory bodies. So what are statutory rights for that matter? So statutory rights are rights under the statutory bodies to get the power from a statute. That is an act enacted by the legislature. So for example, National Investigation Agency, National Human Rights Commission, Lokpal and Lokayukta, etc. What are non-statutory bodies? They usually get the power from an executive order, for example, Niti Aayog, National Development Council, etc. Now, the fundamental rights exist in the Constitution not merely for an individual's benefit, but are a matter of public policy. It is for public well-being and public welfare, not for an individual welfare, so that the people can live at peace in the society. So rights which are part of public policy cannot be waived. Additionally, the Constitution imposes an obligation on the state to protect these rights. Now, fundamental rights known as Magna Carta of Indian Constitution, important fact for your PT, are borrowed from the United States of America. Another important fact, the source of fundamental rights, so which provides its citizens with an option to waive off some of their fundamental rights. Such waiver has evolved from judicial interpretation in the United States. So, jihetu United States of fundamental rights lua hoise, United States of waive off koribo pari, right? So, he babe he question to waiver or question to arise hoise from the judicial interpretation in the United States. A brief discussion on such variation in India and United States was also done in this judgment, and it was explained why the doctrine of waiver does not apply to the Indian Constitution. It is said ours is a nascent democracy and situated as we are socially, economically, educationally, and politically. It is the sacred duty of the Supreme Court to safeguard the fundamental rights which have been for the first time enacted in Part 3 of the Constitution. Let us see some of the landmark judgment regarding waiver of the fundamental rights. Berham Khurshid Pasikaka versus the State of Bombay. In this case, it was held, we think that the rights described as fundamental rights are a necessary consequence of the declaration in the preamble that the people of India have solemnly resolved to constitute India into a sovereign, democratic republic and to secure to all its citizens justice, social, economic and political liberty of thought, expression, belief, faith and worship, equality of status and opportunity. What Olga Tellis versus Bombay Municipal Corporation has to say, in this case, it was further held that there can be no estoppel against the Constitution. The preamble of the Constitution states India to be a democratic republic and no citizen could barter away with fundamental rights. So based on this judgment, it was decided that fundamental rights enshrined in Part 3 of the Constitution cannot be waived off. Now coming to the next news, ISRO solar mission to be launched on September 2nd. So this is a very fact-based information. Remember, for your PT perspective, ISRO solar mission to be launched on September 2nd. After the successful Chandrayaan-3 mission, the Indian Space Research Organization ISRO is geared up to launch its first solar mission. The name is Aditya L1 to study the sun. Remember the name. The Aditya L1 is scheduled to launch on September 2nd, 2023. Remember this date. The U.R. Rao Satellite Center URSC in Bengaluru assembled Aditya L1, India's first observatory class space-based solar mission, which was then handed to the Satish Dhawan Space Center in Sriharikota on August 14 to 2023 according to the ISRO. Now Aditya L1 mission, let us know more about it. What is it? Aditya L1 mission is the first space-based observatory class Indian solar mission. The spacecraft is planned to be placed in a halo orbit around the Lagrange point 1 of the Sun-Earth system. So a satellite placed in the halo orbit around L1 point has the major advantage of continuously viewing the sun without any occultation/eclipse. So what will it do? This will provide a greater advantage of observing solar activities continuously. So the spacecraft carries 7 payloads. How many payloads? 7 payloads to observe the photosphere, chromosphere and the outermost layer of the sun, that is the corona, using electromagnetic and particle detectors. So using the special vantage point of L1, 4 payloads directly view the sun and the remaining 3 payloads carry out in situ studies of the particles and fields at the Lagrange point L1. So what are the objectives of this mission? It will study solar upper atmospheric, that is chromosphere and corona dynamics. It will also study the chromospheric and coronal heating, physics of the partially ionized plasma, initiation of the coronal mass ejections and flares. Next, it will observe the in situ particles and plasma environment, providing data for the study of particle dynamics from the sun. It will study the physics of solar corona and its heating mechanism, diagnostic of the coronal and coronal loops plasma, such as temperature, velocity and density will be studied, development dynamics and origins of CMEs, identify the sequence of processes that occur at multiple layers, that is chromosphere, base and extended corona. We will study the magnetic field topology and magnetic field measurements in the solar corona, drivers for safe space weather, origin, composition and dynamics of solar wind will be studied. So these are some of the major objectives. Coming to the next news from the editorial of the Hindu newspaper, at Delhi summit demonstrates climate leadership. So this article has been written by Stockholm Environment Institution, and it talks about how forum like G20 can be used to enhance our fight against climate change. Because when it comes to climate change, all the countries belonging to the G20, they are responsible for majority of carbon emissions which are happening out in the nature. It is very pertinent, therefore, for these nations to discuss what can be done. If they can rectify their own causes, then chances are there that the global emission can be reduced to a lot. So all of these nations have their net zero target. Similarly, India also have its net zero target, that is by 2070. Then all of these countries in the G20 have their own requirements for renewables. In 2010, the amount of renewable energy used in these countries was 19%, and that has been 29% only. So the amount of renewable energy was, however, is significantly increasing. India has claimed that by 2030, it will be using 40% of energy from renewables. So India, being a host of G20, sets a good example in this context, because it's using only 40% of, and it's using 40% of energy from the renewables. Let us see more to it. The G20 members generate the majority of the world fossil fuels. The majority of them also vow to utilize net zero emissions. The G20 must behave as a single entity that advances its own shared climate ambition. The G20 nations have demonstrated some commitment to the transition of clean energy. The third largest producer of renewable energy in the world, India has made considerable stride in the past 10 years. Governments need to make a greater shift since demand is rising and the world's carbon budget is depleting more quickly than anticipated. Now, clear governance structure. G20 nations must enhance their governance structure at the national and multinational levels to ensure equitable energy transition. There should be clear governance structure. So to guarantee that the transition process is inclusive and the outcome equitable, government should set up clear government framework. Very important. So in order to create congruent delivery strategies, they may entice investment. This requires defining roles and mandates throughout ministries and across government levels. Indicators of progress should be going beyond the conventional ones, such as net job creation, levels of community resilience and creativity, and who has access to this. For the purpose of coordinating their efforts in the energy transition, G20 nations from multi-ministerial task forces or collaboration between government and non-governmental organizations should be there. So these are the way forward which can be carried out. Next is aiding decarbonization. The G20 should view this transformation as a chance to diversify the economies of its members in order to guarantee long-term economic stability. The G20's joint commitment to green public procurement will hasten the decarbonization of challenging industries like steel and cement. Next is international financial institutions. International financial institutions must coordinate their investment and risk-taking in order to quickly install significant amounts of renewable energy. The G20 countries play a crucial role in increasing the production of low-carbon steel since they account for 90% of world steel production. They may encourage investment in the transition to green steel in poor and emerging economies by establishing explicit mandates for international financial institutions. So these are some of the way forward that should be carried out. Next, coming to the next topic, it's on news media versus OpenAI ChatGPT. Now, so we all know what OpenAI is, that is ChatGPT. So here different news media platforms and a group of news media organizations, including the New York Times, Reuters, CNN, and the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, that is ABC, they have shut off the accessibility of OpenAI ChatGPT into their platforms. There are a series of reasons why they have done this. You need to know the basics of how this ChatGPT works. We will talk about the model called ChatGPT. They do operate on what is referred to as LLMs or large language models. Now these large language models, they are able to give an apt response to any of your queries. Anything you type in ChatGPT, they have an answer to it. So based upon their own browsing of the entire text and how the humans communicate it, so they basically scan through all the data which is available on the internet. They go through various articles, news reports, etc. And accordingly, they make learning very easy. So for this, they need to go through a series of various news websites out there. Now the problem that these news websites have as of now is that they allege that ChatGPT is infringing their copyrights, in the sense that ChatGPT is picking up content directly from these news articles and putting it out there without providing enough credit or without providing the source. So that brings various different issues. It brings out the issue of intellectual property. That, let's suppose ChatGPT will continue to hammer out such particular experts from the various different news portals out there, then what is the benefit of maintaining these news portals? News portals at also, that is why you have the problem with ChatGPT. That is why the news portals are having problem with ChatGPT, that all these media channels are facing. They take all the information out there and without giving any credit to the news portals. Now, all these LLMs, that is a large language model program, matter. Even Google in a way is serving as LLM. Now, many of these programs, they use what is referred to as crawlers. Right. Now, crawlers or spiders is a software analogy in the software context. Now, that talks about the program and the software program which will scan through the entirety of the text available in the internet and learn accordingly and pick up materials from there. Now you might have a kind of a query that something very similar is done by Googlebot as well, where if you search anything on the internet, the Google will give you export from the articles, let's say the New York Times, etc. So the problem is that these platforms don't have a problem with Google, because while ChatGPT takes the entire data from these platforms, Google directs you to their web page. Because when you search anything to the Google, they will direct you to the links. The traffic is directed to those new portals only. So this way both are benefiting, Google and the news portals. But ChatGPT is picking off, and they are putting information as if it's their own. And the credit goes to nowhere, and that is where copyright infringement is happening. Now, when this new channel will not give access to ChatGPT, it will lower the standard of ChatGPT, and no one will consume it. No one will be using ChatGPT anymore, and this will make ChatGPT less accessible. And it is very important to know that ChatGPT is benefiting from these news platforms and became a global, close to worth around $3 billion. Whereas if it is shut down, then it will not be used by anyone because it will not be giving relevant information. So this push and pull factor which exists is all about copyrights infringement. So that is all for today. Thank you for watching. See you all tomorrow.